Welcome to the Election University podcast, a weekly show where we hear from industry experts who share tips and tricks for winning campaigns. Whether you're running for office now, thinking about it for the future, or just want to know more about campaigns and elections, Election University is for you. With Election University, click, learn, win. And now your host, Jason Bennett and Rainey Cohen.
Hi.
Hello.
Rainey, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you, Jason?
Excellent. Listeners, welcome back to another episode of the Election University podcast. I am your co-host, Jason Bennett.
And I'm Rainey Cohen.
You are the co-host, Rainey Cohen.
Yeah, someone gave me the feedback that they noticed that you always say, I'm your host or I'm your co-host, and that I never title myself. And I don't know why. I don't know why that is. I'm your co-host, Rainey Cohen.
You're just concise, clear.
It's just who I am.
No extraneous words necessary.
I'm Rainey. What's up? Thanks for being here.
Well, today's episode, we're going to be talking about what I think a lot of Democrats and progressives are hoping for, which is a big blue wave this year in the 2018 midterm elections. Not only at the congressional level, but trickling down all the way to our legislative and local races. We're going to be talking about running blue in a field of red.
Which I think is super interesting because I have only ever lived in a blue Democratic stronghold. And when I think about what it might be like to run for office as a Democrat in a sea of Republicans around you, I don't even know how you get the confidence to be like, yes, I can win in this district.
Right. And
I am really looking forward to hearing how you do that.
Yeah. And Democrats have flipped 41 seats. I think if I'm current on that total, between the legislative races and the U.S. Senate race in Alabama and a couple of mayor's races, they've flipped hands from Republican to Democrat 41 times this year. And in many of those races, they are in Trump territory.
Do you mean by this year, do you mean in the 2017, since Trump's election?
Yes, I should say,
okay.
Yeah, within the last year and a half, not just in 2018. Thank you for clarifying that. And so we're going to be talking with the executive director, the former executive director of Idaho's Democratic Party, who had a number of successes in 2006 during the Bush years, who has seen similar Democratic waves come through red and rural areas. And we're going to ask her questions about what do you need to do to optimize the environment to ride this wave, and get a little background from her on, what's the profile that works in these areas and what candidates can do to optimize their best chances. So I'm excited to chat with her. Our guest today is Maria Weeg. She is a partner at Hilltop Public Solutions and also works at Brushfire Strategies. We'll talk to her a little bit about the work that she does. She's senior vice president from Winding Creek Group. And as I mentioned earlier, she was the former executive director of both the Arizona Democratic Party and the Idaho Democratic Party.
And she's also worked in Maine and Alaska under similar circumstances.
Right. Her husband actually was a mayor of a small town in Alaska. She lived up there for a while. So I'm curious to talk to her about that. And maybe
Let's talk about that.
Sarah Palin gossip. I don't know.
I'm in.
Yeah. So let's jump into it. Maria, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
So we went over your resume a little bit before we started, chatting today, and we'd love to know a little bit more about your background, your work in these three states, in particular Alaska, Idaho, and Arizona, and how you got involved in campaign work specifically.
Yeah, well, I think probably I'm not that different than a lot of folks that get involved in campaign work. In some ways, it's like a little bit of an accident, right? I grew up in a pretty political household. My parents were both really, really politically active. They were hippies. I always joke that I grew up knocking on doors and putting up yard signs with my dad for really great folks like Senator Frank Church from Idaho and Governor Cecil Andrus. But I come by it really naturally, right? My grandfather on my dad's side was an incredible conservationist. Very, white collar, college educated, but super naturalist, cared so much about the outdoors, but also a very strong Catholic and a very strong social justice Catholic. And then my grandfather on my mom's side was a railroad guy, so very strong union influence. And so everything that sort of makes up Democratic politics, should I self-disclose that I'm a Democrat, or maybe you all already said that? it's sort of like a piece of who I am, right? So like from a very young age, I was instilled with these kind of ideals about what the world should look like, but then also a very strong sense of if you want the world to look like that, you've got to be involved, right? Whether it's in your union or knocking on doors or being involved in your church, like my paternal grandfather was. Like there was a very strong ethic of you have to get involved. And so fast forward, a couple of decades after being a kid and knocking on doors and putting up yard signs, I was in graduate school, and a woman that was in a class with me just said, "Hey, I'm on the platform committee, and I'm going to the state party's Democratic convention. And I think you would love to be on the platform committee. Do you want to come and do that? It'll be so much fun. You get to talk about philosophy, write the general kind of tenets of what the party is going to stand for this year." And I was like, "Oh, sure, I'll do that." And
so she so she lied to you essentially by saying it was going to be fun.
I mean, this is really my Genesis story. She was like, "It's going to be so much fun. You'll meet all these great people. You get to talk about philosophy and politics." I was like, "I'm in." So I walk in the door of this convention, and it is like the early 2000s, right? And I am like probably one of about 10, maybe 5 people in the room under the age of 40.
Oh no!
And all of a sudden, I was everybody's best friend. They were like, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" And then they asked me to run for the executive committee of the state party, and they were like, "It'll be so much fun. You meet great people. You meet 4 times a year." And I was
more
like,
lies.
"All right,
more lies. And
I was in, and I was hooked. And and that just sort of started me down the road of then eventually getting a job working for the Idaho Democratic Party coordinated campaign in the 2002 cycle. And then I worked for the mayor of Boise as his field director, which was a really extraordinary race. It was the first time we had a Democrat elected as mayor of the city of Boise, maybe forever. Totally took the Republicans by surprise. And that launched my foray into being an executive director in state party politics. And once I started doing real world politics, I mean, it's pretty addictive. You all both know, right? It's very addictive.
Yeah, that's true. That's great. So I think that there are folks that are listening to the podcast that might not necessarily be aware of party politics and like how it breaks down and who's in charge and what decisions they make. They might have gotten their information from the 2016 election cycle.
Mm-hmm. Rough.
Let's not relive that, but you know what I'm saying. And so they may not have a clear idea of what the role of the state party might be in some of these races, particularly maybe even nonpartisan races. Can you walk us through a little bit about what your responsibilities were when you were heading up the state parties?
Sure. And I think it's important to note that state parties really differ from state to state in terms of what their structure is, how many people are on some of their leadership committees. A lot of it is based on the same sort of political jurisdictions that we're all really familiar with: precincts, legislative districts, counties. The leadership of the state parties is oftentimes made up based on those political jurisdictions. But the central job of the party organization, whether it's your local party organization, your county party, your state party, even the national party to some extent, is to provide sort of an overarching home for Democrats. I'm just going to use Democrats because that's how I know to talk. And to provide a certain level of services in some way, shape, or form. And then ultimately to different levels to help do the candidate nomination process. And so as a state party executive director, a lot of it is, making sure that you're providing good information to candidates, looking for and recruiting good candidates, being a support system to current elected officials, potential elected officials, maintaining a voter file and being able to provide that data to candidates, being able to provide, good training and support to help people, particularly newer candidates that need more help sort of navigating the system. How do I file for office? How do I pick a treasurer? How do I start raising money? How do I go out and talk to voters? Which voters should I talk to? In a lot of places, state parties really fill that role of providing that level of support to new candidates.
So you were an executive director in both Idaho and Arizona, is that correct?
Yes.
Can you talk about what some of the similarities or the differences were between those two roles?
Yeah, and they were actually, it was such a great experience to be an executive director in states like that. And I would say the biggest difference between Idaho and Arizona, just in terms of the overall role of the state party, in Idaho, when I was the executive director, we had one statewide elected official, the superintendent of public instruction at the time, but she wasn't terribly involved with the apparatus of the state party. She was an amazing leader. She was such a terrific advocate for Idaho schools and Idaho kids, but she wasn't a politician at all. She wasn't terribly political, and so she didn't really get involved with the state party apparatus. So it was really the job of the party to provide that kind of political leadership for Democrats in Idaho. Very much led the effort on recruiting candidates up and down the ticket, digging in on what the messaging should be, working with our legislators to think through that, and kind of fill that role of the political apparatus within the state. And so that was very much about, it was really like a lot of a strategy role, right? Kind of looking at the numbers, analyzing the districts, thinking about what the strategic goals and objectives for any given election year should be, thinking about what kind of candidates would be the best candidates to recruit, working really closely with the Democratic House and Senate leaders to make sure we were doing that recruitment well, make sure we were training the candidates well, and then supporting them. And then all the way up to the top of the ticket, right? Recruiting top of the ticket candidates and providing that support, running what is called a coordinated campaign, which helps focus on, turning out the strongest level of Democratic support up and down the ticket for Democratic candidates. That was a really heavy focus in Idaho. The state party really played that leadership role in building that political apparatus. In Arizona, it was fantastic to move to Arizona because when I was there, Janet Napolitano was governor, Terry Goddard was attorney general. They had just elected Gabby Giffords and Harry Mitchell. There was a special election for another congressional seat shortly after I got there. We elected Ann Kirkpatrick. So there were a lot of high federal and statewide office holders.
Some exciting momentum happening there right when you get there.
Super exciting momentum. But also, Governor Napolitano's organization really understood the role that the state party could play in almost being the political arm for all of those folks, right? And so working with those statewide and federal office holders, there was a lot more support, right? So there was more resources, there was more fundraising support for the state party, but there was also great political support because all of those folks had their political operations working hand in hand with us. So the governor's political people would be essentially embedded with us at the state party, working on the strategy, helping raise money, helping recruit and support candidates, being involved with the coordinated campaign. The Attorney General's office had their political person. Each of the congressional offices had their political people. Oh, and we had Congressman Grijalva, who's still in office, Congressman Pastor. And so it was a really amazing group of people to be working with there, but very different dynamics, right? Coming from Idaho, and it was a little bit of a steep learning curve because coming from Idaho, I was, in a lot of ways, I worked very, very closely with our legislative leadership, but we were like this little tiny kind of group of folks that was essentially crafting the strategy together. Fast forward to Arizona, there were a lot more folks at the table. And so learning how to navigate that, navigate the different personalities, make the best, take the best advantage of all of the advice and help that was coming my way. There was a little bit of a steep learning curve, but it was cool to see both of those models of what a state party can be. And it's different. And neither one of these places, right, were battleground states. A place like Florida or Ohio, Pennsylvania, those state parties are entirely different operations because they're presidential battleground states. And so they also then have the influx of national attention on them in election years, that it's a whole other level of involvement.
So, and then walk us through a little bit your time in Alaska and the experience that you had there.
Yeah, so Alaska's really different, right? So Alaska is just geographically enormous. And I moved to Alaska, Jason, you'll remember this. I moved to Alaska because I had finished in Arizona, and I decided it was time to focus on my personal life. And my now husband grew up in a small town in Southeast Alaska, a small island community. And that's when I moved from being a state party executive director and kind of an on-the-ground operative to being a consultant, because I was like, I need to be here and focus on my personal life, but I also really want to be involved, continue to be involved in politics. So that's when I started doing consulting and working for a phones firm. So it was cool because I got to be involved in the on-the-ground work that was going on in my community, but still be involved in races all over the country. So in Alaska, I ended up doing a lot of the first thing that I did when I moved there, the local community had, right before I moved there, tried to pass a bond to get a new playground at the elementary school. The playground at the elementary school was old and dangerous, and they hadn't been able to pass that bond. And I went to the superintendent and I said, look, you only need 400 votes or something. I've done a little of this work. I would love to help with this. I would love to help pull together people who really care about this and think about how to do this in a little bit more deliberate way, because we should have a safe playground, and certainly you should be able to get the 400 votes you need. I think it was 465. And so that's one of the very first things that I did was work in that community, and pulled a group of people together to help get the playground bond passed. And it passed. And so now there's this great playground on the school ground. And whenever we go back to visit my in-laws, I get to walk past the playground, and I feel a great deal of pride about that.
That's cool. Jason mentioned in the intro that your husband was a mayor of a small town in Alaska. Is this that same town?
The same exact town he was. When I moved up there, he was on the assembly. He was the vice mayor. And then shortly after I moved there, he was mayor. So the interesting thing about that is that it gave me a very close-up view, and I think probably has made me better at what I do, at how running for office and being an elected official impacts families and close friends and the people who love a person the most in the world. Because I had always been in that camp, right, where I was just like, oh, why does the family have to be difficult? Why can't they just let their person go out and campaign 24/7? And why do they want them home for dinner one night a week? And, not necessarily all that understanding of it, because I was always so focused on winning elections. And then actually living with somebody who's an elected official and loving somebody who's an elected official, I had a much deeper appreciation for, what we are asking candidates to do, what we're asking candidates to give of themselves, and what we're asking families and friends and loved ones to sacrifice as well, right? And both in terms of time and emotional energy.
It's like we're all doing the public service together, right? Those of us who love people who work in campaigns or love people who are elected officials. It's like it takes a village, I guess, for a corny phrase.
For sure.
Right? No candidate or no elected official does it by themselves. There's always this network of people around them that it's like a requirement that we all just understand limited amounts of time and higher stress job over there. And that becomes the focus point and the most, you have the most important job.
Yeah, absolutely. Not to mention the fact that you have to hear people say mean things, right, about the person that you love the most in the world. Because even if you're a place where you've got somebody who's an incredibly popular elected official, there's politics is rough, man, and you have to understand that a little bit. And I think oftentimes I think it's the elected officials who can let that stuff roll off their backs a little bit more easily than the family members who have to hear things, right? And they're like, wait a minute, that's not who my husband is, right? That's not, why would they say that about that person? I can't even, imagine Michelle Obama, the stuff that she had to hear about her husband, right?
Right. Or Melania Trump, for that matter.
Do not envy that woman right now.
Or Melania Trump, exactly.
I mean, just to be fair,
right.
I mean, she probably has to suffer through a lot. Barron. I mean, I'm sure they all have to. All right, let's not go there. So it's really.
I don't know that I can. I don't know that I can go there, Jason.
So what we had an episode, a few episodes back about political spouses. It seems to me that you could offer some really constructive feedback for a part 2 on that. That has been one of our most popular episodes. I think largely because there aren't many resources for spouses out there and what they're getting into when they sign up to, join this political orbit.
Yeah.
They don't really know what's involved. And I think you could offer some good insight in that one.
Oh, well, have you read that book that Sherrod Brown's wife wrote?
No.
I can't remember the name, but she wrote like this incredible book essentially about being a political spouse. And it's like, it's a very, very, very helpful piece, right? Because there's so much about it. And then I think the other piece to remember about being a political spouse is that, and Rainey, I think it goes to what you were saying. It's like all of a sudden there's this person in the household who is the most important person. And you're like, wait a minute, I'm still a person in my own right? I'm still a person who has thoughts and ideas and plans, but you guys should definitely read her book because it's incredible.
Oh, good. We'll include that in the show notes too for any folks that are wanting more resource after that episode. I felt like we only scratched the surface. It was our longest episode, but we, I think barely just scratched the surface of it. Let's take a little bit of a left turn now and talk about the electorates in particular in these 3 states where you have experience. What are the differences or the similarities in the voters in Idaho versus Arizona versus Alaska?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think so. The first fundamental piece about these states, and I think it's true of a lot of the red states, is that geographically they are huge, really, really huge. I mean, Alaska, if you overlay Alaska on a map of the continental United States, it almost engulfs it. Idaho is literally what was left over when all the states around it were carved out. And that ends up being literally, and it ends up being really important to the political makeup of the state, not just now, but when it was in its first inception. Like there's nothing about Idaho that had any continuity to be a state in its own right. So it has 3 very distinct geographies that are different culturally, are different economically, have been very different politically. And then Arizona is interesting because Arizona is very much a state that is just in a constant state of new people moving in, and people who are moving from places, the Midwest, colder climates, for a very specific reason, right? And so don't necessarily, Arizona, you will find Arizonans who have been Arizonans for a long time that have a really, really strong sense of place. You'll also find a lot of Arizonans that are relatively new, and they bring the politics of their place with them. So I think the thing that all 3 of the states have in common is that you really have to navigate some different constituencies and figure out how to talk to different groups of people. And then I also think just like one of the things that we're seeing generally that plays out in all of these states, and I think most of the states that I've worked in, where you may have 1 or 2 urban areas that are wildly different in terms of culture and politics than the rest of the state. So you have to try to figure out how to navigate, how do we, if you're running for something statewide, it's much more difficult than if you're running in a legislative district or a county in a smaller jurisdiction. But you have to navigate how can we motivate voters that have really different ideas about what they want in an elected official, right? How do we motivate the base areas of our state, the more urban areas of our state, the more democratic areas of our state, and at the same time be able to talk to more conservative voters that live in those rural areas.
Kind of speaks to the candidate recruitment part of this. And we're curious about is candidate recruitment, how different is candidate recruitment between these different constituencies, and what would be your definition of a good candidate? I imagine that changes from state to state.
Yeah. And the funny thing about that is I don't think my definition of a good candidate changes from state to state or from district to district. I think one of the things that we have done as Democrats, and I'm going to kind of smack us on the forehead a little bit for that, is that I feel like oftentimes we try to take shortcuts, right? We find something that worked in one place and we're like, oh, in red states, you should try to recruit somebody who's been a farmer or a veteran or a soccer mom, or we try to try to find these identity markers to shortcut for what a good candidate is. At the end of the day, I think what makes a good candidate, and I think who we ought to be looking for, are people who have a connection to their community, whether they're running for a county or legislature or city, Congress or statewide. Someone who has an authentic connection to their community, has been doing work in their community around, and it doesn't matter what that work has been. Maybe they've been a teacher, maybe they've been a doctor, maybe they've been working and advocating on a particular issue. But through that, they have built a lot of very real relationships with people in their community. I think it's much more important to find somebody who understands how to build those kinds of relationships, has worked to build those kinds of relationships, is genuinely curious about other human beings and brings that into the work that they do, does more listening than talking. But the overarching piece of that is that we have to be looking for candidates who are authentic and can authentically connect with other human beings, and not try to then mold them into what some larger idea of a great candidate is going to be. Because being authentic and being able to make a connection with voters goes an awfully long way. And I think we see that in candidates who are able to buck national trends or win in districts that people say you've got no business winning in, right? I think we see that in people like John Tester in Montana, or Steve Bullock in Montana, who was just reelected governor, even though Trump won Montana by 20 points or something like that. So I think it's that authenticity piece more than it is any sort of checklist of particular accomplishments or, anything that some of the big national groups would say make a good candidate.
I just want to make sure that I underscore and highlight and bold and asterisk what you're saying on this. So I'm going to repeat it if you don't mind. So I think the thing that concerns progressives and Democrats, generally speaking, is that we're watching these races get flipped, right? We've had 41 of them flip from Republican to Democrat since Trump was elected. And, we're getting into some issue ideology wars about issues like choice, issues like LGBTQ rights, gun ownership and gun control, all of those really hot button issues that tend to mobilize conservatives in red areas, but splinter the Democratic Party in terms of, particularly when it comes to recruitment and looking for candidates that quote unquote fit the district, meaning that they're maybe more conservative on Democratic platform issues. And so you're saying no to that it is better for a candidate to be a more authentic fit, deep roots in a community, and be able to connect with voters on an emotional level than it is to move towards the center on issues, given your experience.
Yeah. And I think that in general, we should be running people who are real. And yes, we should do everything in our power to help them be the best versions of themselves as possible, right? No doubt. I'm not saying that somebody should just get up in the morning and I roll out of bed in the morning and go to work in my pajamas, right? Like I get up and try to put on some decent clothes and brush my hair. And like, I'm trying to present the best version of myself. And we should absolutely be helping candidates do that. We absolutely should be helping using research and using data to help inform the ways in which we're running campaigns. We also have to find candidates and let them be themselves with voters, because I'll tell you what, voters are exponentially smarter than we give them credit for. And when we, I've not tested this scientifically, so there's probably going to be data people out there that hear this and think that I'm like full of baloney. But I think that we do much better if we put a candidate out there who may disagree with some of the folks in their district on some issues, but are honest about it, than when we try to help our candidates equivocate on any particular issue, right? And whether that's like, the whole thing that's going on with the base is a little difficult, right? Because I think that gets into another conversation, right? Where I just think in some cases, like, we have to figure out collectively as a base how to be a big tent again. Mm-hmm. But when we're talking to like persuadable voters, which you cannot in a lot of these red states, and this is where the science comes in, you cannot get elected in many districts in many states around this country with just the Democratic base vote. You need to be able to go out there and talk to people and be authentic, and they need to trust you and they need to believe you. And I think that it's much better to say about maybe any of these hot button issues, if they come up, well, here's what I think about that, and have them know you're telling them the truth, even if they don't agree with you on that particular issue, than to try to equivocate and sound as if you agree with them when you really don't, because they can smell right through that. I mean, they smell it on us when we do that. I mean, we have got to be authentic, and we've got to be communicating, and we've got to be like talking to people where they're at. And that means, if they're at the grocery store, go to the grocery store. If they're at the Elks Club, go to the Elks Club. I have this awesome candidate I'm working with in Maine's 2nd congressional district right now. And he spent 5 years working on a really controversial conservation project. And he said, I used to just go to the dump and have conversations with people at the dump, because that's where they were, right? Like, that's where they were hanging out. Everybody had to go there. So I think it's part of understanding what your district is. And it goes back to that being curious about people and being willing to reach out and have real conversations with people and let voters know you as a real human being, not necessarily like the doctored up, prettied up, equivocating person that we tend to put out there.
Right. Well, I mean, I'm not pushing back on this. I'm just maybe thinking about this also from a recruitment standpoint, right? So you're talking about how to make a candidate a best version of themselves and not to moderate their stances of what they personally feel. But when the party then is proactively going out there and looking for candidates, right? Or, party structures, donors, interest groups start backing candidates, in these contested races, should they say that these contentious issues don't matter, that there should be more authenticity? I guess I'm thinking about things like Heath Mello in that Oklahoma mayor's race, right? He is anti-choice, and that divided, and re-ruptured the Bernie-Hillary contest. A lot of those feelings because Bernie had backed Heath Mello for the race, and there was
a bunch of Democrats felt like choice is not negotiable, right, in the Democratic Party platform, no matter where you're running.
Right. I mean, and I don't expect Maria to solve, essentially this war that has been bleeding over for the last, year and a half, 2 years in the Democratic Party. But I am curious, given your experience, did you elect pro-choice candidates in these red areas? Did you have gun control advocates that were elected to office in these areas? And do you think, more importantly, this year, given that it's very different than the last blue wave that you were involved in, can it happen again?
I think yes. I mean, I think this is also one of the most really difficult things because full disclosure, it's really hard for me as like a, staunchly pro-choice person to say that shouldn't be something that we see as important, as a bedrock of our core value, right? I will say that I think that the important piece is if we're finding candidates that really know and understand their district, that really have a heart for the folks, that yes, these wedge issues are used like weapons against us, but we also see these races happen where if you've got someone who's got deep roots in their community, if you've got someone that's got personal relationships in their community, and if you've got somebody who is talking about the issues that transcend some of the wedges, we can see them win. Because at the end of the day, most folks, when they sit down to have a conversation with you, aren't sitting down and having a conversation about the wedge issues. And if they are, you're probably not going to get them anyway, right, on either side, right? On our side or the other side. When you sit down and you talk to most voters, the stuff that they're worried about is the stuff that transcends all of that. Like, are my kids going to have a good job? Are they doing well in school? Are they safe in school? Do I have health care? What happens if one of my parents gets sick? Do I have enough room to bring them in? Do I have the money to buy groceries next month? Can I afford to take my family on a vacation? Am I going to have a job next year? I mean, getting back to some of that those bread and butter issues about what that's, I think, what most folks around the country are really talking about. And it's really easy to get lured into conversations about the wedge issues, which isn't to say that they're not important. I mean, I would argue that, where we have come on many of the issues that are near and dear, like I think to all of our hearts, right? I think we're much better off for having marriage equality now, right? And I would argue that tooth and nail. I also think that when you start digging in these districts, what most folks want to talk about, if you go to their door, are the things that worry them on a day-to-day basis. And what worries them on a day-to-day basis isn't necessarily marriage equality. It is oftentimes the cost of healthcare, education, jobs, the economy. Am I better off now than I was 2 years ago? Are my kids going to be better off? And so I think those bread and butter issues become really, really important. I also think that at the end of the day, people want to feel important and they want to feel respected. So if you've got a candidate who's able to do that in their communication and is able to do that in the way that they interact with voters, that goes a really, really long way.
Excellent. Okay. So I'm Jason Bennett. I'm thinking about running in this rural area, and I've been deeply involved in the community for a long time. What advice would you give me as I'm filing for office, pulling my vendors together, as I'm thinking about, my message and whatnot? What advice would you give me to increase my chances? We definitely talked about authenticity. Are there persuasion tactics or areas, where folks can go to, increase their chances? Like, what are your tips on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, there's no replacement for knocking on doors, right? I mean, I am still, and that's my bias. I come out of field. That's where I cut my teeth is in field. So I think there's no replacement for knocking on doors and having as many conversations with voters as you can. I think it's also really important, particularly for new candidates, to find somebody that you trust, because one of the first things that's going to happen when you run for office is all of a sudden everybody that you know has watched The West Wing. And they've watched House of Cards, and they're pretty sure that they know how to win elections, right? And so I think as a new candidate, one of the hardest things is trying to make your way through all of the advice that you're getting. And which is why this podcast is such a cool idea, right? Because trying to find a place where candidates can get really solid advice and have somebody that they trust that's sort of like their true north that can help them navigate all of these pieces of advice. So whether that's your campaign manager, whether that's some sort of a senior level strategist that you might have access to, you want to have, one or two people that you really trust that can help you like cut through all of that advice. And then I would say, find somebody, who's done it before and who's done it well. What fundraising tactics did they use that were successful for them? I mean, there's some pretty tried and true stuff out there, right? What kinds of messages are resonating in the community? Like focus in and hone in there, and really think through. There are a million things I can do in any given day. Is the thing that I'm about to do going to help me talk to voters? Is it going to help me raise money? Is it going to help me get my name ID out there? If it doesn't do one of those three things, then you just need to let it go, right? Because at the end of the day, you're never going to be able to do every single thing that you want to be able to do. Campaigns are finite. There's finite resources in campaigns, unless maybe you're Joel Ossoff. There's finite time, right? Like you kind of have to get over the idea that you're going to be able to run a pitch perfect campaign and do every single little thing you want to do the way that you want to do it.
Yeah.
You have to be like, okay, if I can do 85%, that's going to be awesome.
Yeah.
And then find folks that can help you make some of those decisions.
I want to work on a campaign at some point where I have so much money that I get to pay voters their Uber ride to the polling locations, like John Ossoff's campaign did.
Did they do that?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing.
Free Uber rides.
He didn't win though, but he didn't win, right? So
yeah.
It's not.
Money's not always everything.
Right.
Money's not always everything. I don't know, Jason, if that answered your question or not. I mean, it maybe wasn't very specific.
No,
I really do think that that finding somebody who can be your true north is the most helpful thing, because as a brand new candidate, I think it's so overwhelming.
Right.
Yeah.
As you're telling me this, it's making me think about these 41 seats that we've flipped, right? And how in some of these districts, more than half of them are in districts where Trump won by more than 10 points. So they're probably, there's more than the science part of it that they're calculating. And I've been struggling, I think, since some of these wins really picked up momentum last year with the Virginia and, obviously huge Alabama Senate race. What's the common thread that's sort of weaving through this? Obviously, there's some national overlay, right? Some national politics that are playing a part in this, and people are reacting and mobilizing against Trump and the Republican Party. But not every single special election where a Democrat is against a Republican has netted a Democratic win, for example. So what's the common thread? I mean, they're obviously riding a wave, but are they raising the same amount of money? Is everybody working together and on the same page? Are there certain endorsements that they're staying away from? I'm trying to get a sense of, what is it for folks who are thinking about maybe running for office this year, right? They're still in the decision-making process. The filing deadline hasn't hit. They're really weighing their decision-making, but they're in a red area. Should they do it? Should they not do it? Is it fair to look at these races like the one in Wisconsin where the woman picked up 30 Republican points and trounced the Republican opposition? Can that be replicated again and again, or are these just special, unique circumstances because they're special elections and people are particularly energized now, but when the ballot's more crowded in, the fall, it's going to be more difficult for folks to do that? I'm just curious if you think that there's this, one, if there's a common thread, and two, is this going to be replicated?
Well, I do think there's some common threads, and I don't think if you're trying to make a decision about whether or not to run for office, whether or not it can be replicated is the important question. If you want to run for office and you feel like you have a voice and a passion and a calling to do it, you should absolutely run for office, right? We need more people running for office. We need all kinds of people running for office. We need young people. We need women. We need people of color. We need folks in the LGBTQ community. We need all kinds of people running for office, right? And that, to me, is a little bit of a separate conversation from, is there a common thread, and is it something that will replicate, because we do better and we have more choices and we have more chances when we have more people running for office and out there talking to voters and out there representing their communities and getting that experience. And you know what, if you don't win, like pick yourself up, brush yourself off, and do it again. Figure out what you did well, what you wish you would have done better, because sometimes it takes a couple times at bat, 3 times at bat before you win. I've gone through that a dozen times or more. I feel like, can we just take Alabama out of the conversation? Because I find it just it's really unusual to run against a bona fide pedophile, right?
But even before those allegations came out, Roy Moore was only 5 points up in the polling. So there was something happening there with the electorate. Not saying that that's sustainable, or if Trump, leaves office, unwillingly, or decides not to run again for election, or is defeated in 2020, that's going to sustain beyond 2020. I think that you had a candidate. Doug Jones was not a bad candidate. He was an excellent candidate, and excited enough people, obviously, to vote for him, but had kept the polls close even before the child molestation charges came out. So there is this wind at the back of Democrats, right? And I think the thing that I'm trying to maybe understand a little bit better is candidates are going to do a needs assessment, right? They're going to weigh it's a cost benefit analysis they're going to do before they file. Can I win this race? Is it reasonable for me can I raise the money? Can I carve out the time? Is this a winnable race? And that winnable race is probably the stumbling block for a lot of folks who are running in red areas, right?
Yep.
Except for maybe this year. And I think we're really clear, Rainey and I are very clear about not giving people false hope, right? And saying, just because Doug Jones did it in Alabama doesn't mean that you can necessarily do it in Idaho or Arizona or Alaska or, in your rural area, in your bluish state. But at the counter, it could, right? The planets could align properly with this wind. And we're trying to maybe unpack a little bit what those optimal environments are. And I think you're really hitting it on the head when you're talking about the authenticity and talking about, kitchen table, bread, butter issues, making sure that you have authentic conversations with people at the door and doing lots of that is the common thread. I am curious to know the party's role, you think, in some of these races, and if, everyone's just marching to the same beat and really everyone's kind of lifting the same boats together too.
Yeah, well, I think you make a really good point. And when you're doing that calculus about should I run for office, there's definitely a few things you need to keep in mind, right? So one, how much, and this is information you can kind of find by looking at what people have raised and spent in your district or in similar districts. What is a realistic budget? And that's based on math, right? There's a certain number of votes you need to get. You need to touch voters in a certain number of ways. That costs a specific kind of amount. There's a way to come up with what do I generally need to raise? And then you sit down and make a list of all the people that you think that that you've got relationships with that would donate to you, and assign a number, right, of what you think that you would be comfortable asking them for. Because at the end of the day, a lot of these things, the resources that you're able to raise, come from your connections, right? There's not this magical pot of party money out there that is bestowed upon these candidates. You still have to work for the fundraising. You still have to have those kinds of connections and people to fundraise from. And it's the same thing with volunteers. In a more crowded field, right, in Alabama, when that was the show in town, there were a lot of volunteers that were coming to the table from all over the place, all over the country, all over the South, all over Alabama, and helping in that race. In November, there's going to be a lot more competition. So the volunteers you're going to bring to the table, again, are probably not just the generic party volunteers. They're the folks that you know and have personal relationships. So you do, I think, have to do some of that assessment to say, have I built sufficient relationships through my life that I have a pool of people from which I can get financial contributions, volunteer contributions, because you can't win without some of those two things. And those two things really come from the work you've done in your life. That being said, I think what we are seeing are far more people now who are motivated to give and motivated to volunteer. So, a candidate who sits down and writes a list of 200 people that they know that they could ask for money in a different year, maybe got contributions from 100 of those people. And in this year, may be able to get contributions from 175 of those people because people are more motivated. So I think that's part of where we're seeing the extra energy coming from, or people who have never been involved before who are saying, we're seeing that all over the place, right? People who have never given politically or never volunteered. And there's so many ways to engage now. I think I told you guys I was listening to that, Voter Circle podcast that you all did a couple of weeks ago. And what a great volunteer opportunity for somebody who's an introvert, right? Because on campaigns, a lot of our volunteer opportunities are really for extroverts. Like, oh, come knock on doors, come make phone calls. And the introverts amongst us are like, are you kidding me?
I hate it. Now? I hate knocking on doors. I got to be really motivated and really love a candidate in order to put myself out there. And usually I have like one shift worth. I'm not a repeat door knocker.
Right? But you'll like sit down and email your friends.
Totally.
If you feel like that is something that can help you make a difference. So that being said, I think that's also the thread that we're seeing in a lot of these races is that, one, there's more energy. So givers are giving more, volunteers are volunteering more, non-givers are starting to give, non-volunteers are starting to volunteer. But the other thing that's happening in a lot of these races is that voters are giving each other permission to vote for these candidates, right? And in the Alabama race, that was really important, right? Like, the Republicans in that race gave Republican voters permission to stay home. And that ended up being important in that race. Supporters of Doug Jones, and while yard signs, I think, are the bane of any campaign operative's existence, in the Jones race, they used them in a really strategic way to help voters give each other permission to vote for Jones, right? I think Voter Circle, like as an email tool where you're sending a personal email about a candidate, is another way of not only persuading, but of voters giving other voters permission to vote for a candidate, right? And so I think that's one of the things that and I know that, all of the stuff is being used like in the Virginia races and in Alabama. And so I think that's a piece of it that we also need to take into consideration, right? We've gotten really good at the social pressure GOTV, which plays on, people's sense of obligation to vote. I think it's a similar dynamic, right? When you're like, oh, well, all my friends, like, oh, tons of people are voting for that person. Oh, yeah, like, okay, even the, like, I can be open to that, right?
Yeah.
And so I do think that's a dynamic that's been happening. I am, however, a little bit of a conspiracy theorist.
Excellent.
Lay it on us.
Go on.
So I'm a little worried that something is going to happen between now and Election Day that, that changes the political dynamic a little bit.
Yeah.
I don't know, I don't know what that would be, but, there are a whole lot of people in charge that are very vested in being in charge.
Yeah.
So whenever anybody asks me if we're going to have a huge wave year, I always say, well, there's an awful lot of time between now and November. An awful lot can happen between now and November.
Yeah. I'm more, maybe less. I do share a certain amount of conspiracy theory with you on that. And there probably is a Venn diagram of the stuff that we share in terms of conspiracy theories. I'm just really like, the Democrats have a very unique way of shooting themselves in the foot and blowing any opportunity that they can. And, and I say this lovingly, like, it is my family. It's, the Democratic Party is my weird uncle that I love, and will do anything for. But we are uniquely set up to blow opportunities. So that does make me nervous.
Yeah.
Well, Maria, just like that platform person that reached out to you in 2000 and lied to you about that being fun, we also lied to you about how much time we were going to take, and you've given us a lot of extra time. So I really appreciate that. Before we wrap up, will you walk us through Hilltop Public Solutions, where you work, and Brush Fire Strategies, and the work you do on campaigns, and where folks can find you if they want to connect up with you at some point?
Oh, yeah, sure. Absolutely. So Hilltop Public Solutions is a national public affairs firm. We do tons of electoral work from school boards all the way up to state houses and United States Senate. We have offices in about 10 different states and a website, hilltoppublicsolutions.com. And I get to work with really, really great political minds all over the country that are working on all kinds of different races. We do a lot of issue advocacy work as well as campaign work, which is good, right? Like kind of keeps our minds engaged. And then Brush Fire Strategies is, I think I mentioned when I first dipped my toe into political consulting, it was on the paid phone side. So Brush Fire Strategies is a telephone voter contact firm, and we do all of the sort of old school and new school phones work, from automated calls to IVR and live polling and live GOTV and ID and persuasion calls, and finding all kinds of ways to like layer in communications to get to voters. And that's brushfirecalls.com.
Fantastic.
Cool.
Well, this was excellent. You gave folks a lot to think about, and certainly some great advice for those folks who are running maybe in not the bluish of areas. And we really appreciate it. It's always wonderful to talk to you, Maria.
Well, I hope so. Thank you so much, you guys. It was fun to talk to you as well.
Thanks, Maria.
Have a great one.
Yep. You too.
A very big thank you to Maria Weeg of Hilltop Public Solutions and Brush Fire Strategies for joining us today. Excellent conversation. What'd you think, Rainey?
I thought this was great. I really appreciate that there are some themes emerging here among a lot of the people who come on the show to give advice, and that one in particular being to run for office, be an authentic person who is plugged into your community that fits the district that you're running in, and to knock on doors and talk to people, and that conversations, face-to-face conversations, are really the way to connect with voters, really to connect with anyone, but to move your message forward and to get people involved.
Well, I think it's also important for folks to understand, this year is special. It may not extend beyond this year. It may not even happen this year. God forbid.
I'm not putting any eggs in that basket. I'm terrified.
Yeah. But I mean, I think the part of this that I have two schools of thought on it, right? I'm very firmly in the camp, and you and I are both in the same way. We work with young adults and helping mentor them and hopefully channeling them into a way that they will eventually run for office as well someday. You want more participation. You definitely want more people running for office. You want the folks who are driven by the, public service part of this job to step up and do it, as opposed to the folks who are maybe thinking it's a little bit more like West Wing or House of Cards. And I also think it's, our duty is to make sure that people have a realistic understanding of what they're getting themselves into.
Totally.
And that their cost benefit analysis is thorough and setting people up for success, right? I mean, that is the goal.
Yeah. And I think it goes beyond just we need more people running for office, because it doesn't help anyone if 17 people file for office for the same position. What we need is more people running in more geographic places, right? Yeah. And how do we plant those seeds, and where does recruitment come in? What is the party's role in that? What is the community's role in that? How do we motivate people to take that next step and represent their community rather than just being plugged in?
Talking with Maria is always fantastic. She has such an interesting story, and I'm fascinated to hear more about these red areas and the upsets and wins that happen in them. So really great advice. What did you think, listeners? We would love to hear from you. You can email us directly at podcast@electionu.com. We do want to give a quick little shout out to the country of Poland, which now represents our 25th country that we are being downloaded in.
Hey, Poland! What's up?
Hey, Poland. I wish I would have Google translated some Polish that we could say to our
probably wouldn't have been right.
fans over there. It's so weird. I don't understand why anybody outside the U.S. is listening to us, but it's happening. And it's more than just VPN stuff, which is what I thought it was originally. People are just jumping on VPNs in other countries, but they're multiple downloads. So that can't necessarily be.
We're that interesting, Jason. It's okay.
I guess so. So thank you, Poland. We appreciate everything that you're doing for our podcast. So if you could jump on over to iTunes and give us if our Polish listeners out there could jump on iTunes and give us 5 stars and leave us some comments, we would be really appreciative. That stuff helps us in the search engines and makes it a little bit easier for folks who are searching for us on iTunes to find us if we have more comments and ratings. So please jump on over and leave those for us. We're on your favorite podcast app. Thanks again for joining us this week. I'm your co-host, Jason Bennett.
And I'm Rainey Cohen.
Also a co-host. We're going to train me to stop saying, how's everyone doing? We have to train you into calling yourself a host or a co-host.
I mean,
you're not the sidekick. You're the co-host.
I mean, or maybe the intro lady, the pre-recorded intro lady says, here's your hosts, Jason Bennett and Rainey Cohen. Isn't it just redundant after that?
Am I being redundant? Is that what you're telling me?
I don't know. What do the listeners think? Should they comment and tell us? What do you think?
I'm not going to do a survey, for crying out loud. All right.
We'll figure it out before the next one. How's that?
Let's wrap this up. Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. And we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening. This week's episode has ended, but the campaign fun doesn't have to. Head on over to www.electionu.com, where you can access all of the links mentioned in today's episode, as well as the show notes. There you can also sign up for regular announcements or register for our campaign school. It's your very own online personal trainer for winning campaigns. www.electionu.com. Click, learn, win.